Cold or hot New Year's Eve soba? On New Year's Eve, some people insist soba should be served ice cold to highlight its aroma and firm texture, while others refuse to give up a steaming bowl that warms you from the inside. Around the kotatsu, relatives and friends argue every year over whether cold soba or hot soba is the real way to finish the year. Should New Year's Eve soba stay close to its colder historical style, or should we prioritize the warm, comforting version that most people picture today? In this video, we present a 10-round, 20-turn debate where both sides clash on equal footing over whether New Year's Eve soba should be eaten cold or hot. Which bowl would be on your table at the end of the year? Share your stance in the comments. Now let's dive into the debate.
I believe New Year's Eve soba is fundamentally meant to be eaten cold. According to materials from the Japan Noodle Industry Association, when the first soba shops appeared in Edo, soba meant only soba-kiri noodles dipped in sauce, and what we now call kake soba, noodles served in hot broth, does not even appear by name until the late 18th century. Since the custom of eating year-end soba is said to have taken root by the mid-Edo period, the most straightforward reading is that townspeople were then eating soba-kiri very close to today's cold mori or zaru soba as their month-end and year-end soba.
Even so, if you look at the same association's explanation of New Year's Eve soba, the origins they cite are anecdotes about soba mochi and soba gaki, not about cold mori soba anywhere. Stories like the one about serving soba mochi to poor townspeople at Jotenji Temple in Kamakura, or about soba gaki in the Muromachi period, show that the very idea of lucky soba grew out of forms that were not even noodles. The starting point is simply soba in general, so I think it is a bit of a stretch to claim flatly that cold mori soba is the origin.
If we want to avoid leaps in logic, the claim that hot cake soba is just as weakly supported. Explanations from various sources agree that the custom of month-end soba and year-end soba spread among merchant households in the mid-Edo period, but the records simply say soba-kiri or soba without specifying hot or cold. Since the standard menu at that time was soba-kiri eaten by dipping in sauce, at the very least it is more natural to picture something closer to mori soba than to kake soba.
However, in the late Edo period, street stalls selling soba at night became widespread, and in woodblock prints of the time, you see scenes of courtesans and laborers huddling around stalls on snowy nights, sipping hot kake soba. It is more realistic to think that New Year's Eve soba became strongly associated in ordinary people's minds with soba eaten on a cold year-end night only after it linked up with this night soba culture. Even if a cold style may have existed at the initial stage, it was hot soba that played the major role in fixing it as a year-end event.
If you look at the history in a bit more detail, it's actually the other way around. In the earliest form of Edo soba shops, known as kenden soba, the only style was soba-kiri, eaten by dipping it into sauce. After that came a bukake style, where broth was poured over the noodles, and only later did the name kake soba appear. In other words, cold soba-kiri clearly came first, and hot kake soba is the latecomer. Given that the custom of month-end soba, equivalent to year-end soba, spread among merchants in the mid-Edo period, it is consistent to assume that what they were eating at that point was a soba-kiri type dish.
Of course, if you look only at chronology, cold soba-kiri came first. But it is said that the phrase toshikoshi soba itself didn't spread widely until after the Meiji period, when the calendar changed to the Gregorian system. By that time, in home cooking, hot kake soba had already become dominant. For an event food, It matters more that the standard image most Japanese now have when they hear New Year's Eve soba is a hot bowl than whether the historically very first bowl happened to be cold.
However, if you want to savor the meaning of the ritual, it is more rational to choose cold soba, which maximizes the noodle's own aroma and texture. Guides aimed at soba enthusiasts repeatedly point out that cold mori soba is the style that lets you feel soba's flavor and texture most clearly. On the one day of the year when soba is eaten in a symbolic way, choosing noodles that have gone soft and broth with blurred aroma and texture shows rather weak respect for the ingredient itself. Whatever the exact origin, the claim that if it is a soba ritual, cold is more appropriate.
But what is sought from New Year's Eve soba is not a soba tasting competition, but the ritual of closing out the year. When the warm aroma of broth made from kombu, dried bonito, soy sauce, and mirin spreads through the house, everyone can share the feeling that the year is ending. That effect is much harder to get from cold soba. I would say the essence of the event lies less in maximizing the aroma of buckwheat flour alone and more in the sense of unity created when family and friends gather around the same rising steam.
Cold New Year's Eve soba also has advantages in terms of health. Because you only lightly dip cold noodles into the sauce, it is easier to keep your salt intake down than with kake soba, where people tend to drink all the broth. At a time when many age groups are concerned about high blood pressure and lifestyle-related diseases, using "it's the end of the year" as an excuse to take in a big dose of salt is risky. If we want event foods to give at least a small long-term boost to people's health, then cold soba is a smarter design.
On the other hand, sending a load of cold carbohydrates into your stomach in the middle of a winter night is not ideal for your digestion or body temperature. Medical explanations often note that cold food and drink taken just before bed can cool the internal organs and affect the autonomic nervous system and the quality of sleep. In today's lifestyle, where many people go to bed right after finishing their New Year's Eve soba, it is practically more reasonable to have a warm bowl that gently heats the body.
Returning to history, month-end soba originally began as a merchant house custom of serving soba to live-in workers at the end of the month. Part of the reason it spread was precisely because it could be served quickly on a busy month end. With cold sobakiri, you can boil a batch at once, chill it in cold water, and then the quality stays stable even if the serving times are staggered to some extent. If you are feeding many servants and family members in turn on New Year's Eve, operations with cold mori soba are closer to that original idea than the finicky temperature control required for kake soba.
However, once New Year's Eve soba changed into a household event food, the situation changed. In many homes, people are used to hot kake soba or noodles as the finish to a hot pot, and the New Year's Eve bowl lies on that same continuum. The essence of an event food is not only specialness, but also the reassurance that the usual flavor comes to this particular day. On a day when you're trying to mark the turning of the year, switching to a cold bowl that is cut off from everyday habits risks creating a sense of wrongness instead.
You can flip that logic around and deliberately emphasize the event by making a break in continuity. We usually eat hot soba, but only on New Year's Eve we eat it cold. In fact, among soba aficionados, there are quite a few people who insist on ending the year with mori soba and nothing else. Finishing the year with the style that lets you feel the aroma and texture most fully gives you the satisfaction of, I truly tasted soba again this year before it ended. Compared with routine hot soba, a once-a-year cold ritual has more potential to become a memorable conclusion.
However, if you look at actual consumer behavior, the great majority of New Year's Eve soba products sold in supermarkets and convenience stores are microwavable kake soba sets, and cold mori soba sets are a tiny minority. That supply structure itself is evidence that consumer demand is concentrated on an easy hot bowl on a cold night. Separate from the question of which tastes better, we have to admit that, as a shared experience in society, New Year's Eve soba is centered on hot soba.
If you simply follow the majority for the sake of shared experience, there is a danger that the event's meaning will gradually fade. Month-end soba, or lucky soba, originally had fairly conscious elements of fortune-telling, such as cutting off the misfortunes of the year or calling in financial luck. Returning to those roots and choosing cold mori soba, which makes you pay attention to the quality of the buckwheat flour and the way the noodles are made, is, I think, a way of rebooting the meaning of the ritual from the food side, rather than just going with, it's warm, so it's nice.
From the standpoint of good fortune, hot soba does not lose. Drawing up the thin, long noodles and finally drinking the broth to the last drop can be read as a symbolic action of cleanly swallowing up and ending misfortune, or accepting all the blessings without leaving any. In some regions, there's a custom of adding other lucky items, like herring, tempura shrimp, mochi, or fish cakes on top, and it is the bowl of hot kake soba that can hold all of these together. In terms of how far you can expand the symbolism through toppings, hot soba has the broader embrace.
If you add a global perspective, what is introduced overseas as Japanese soba is mainly the cold zaru or mori style. Tourist websites, for example, highlight first the firm texture of chilled noodles and their healthiness as soba's main attractions. For travelers who want to experience Japanese culture at year's end, it may actually be the cold soba that leaves the stronger impression. Japanese people choosing cold soba for New Year's Eve would send a clear message, both inside and outside the country, that this is the core of soba culture.
However, at actual New Year's Eve events, what is most often served to foreign tourists is warm soba in paper cups. After an outdoor countdown in winter, giving them hot broth to sip conveys both the season and a sense of Japanness in a very intuitive way. Cold soba is attractive as a dish in itself, but you have to explain the context that this is eaten in the middle of a winter night. In terms of making the event immediately understandable, I think a steaming bowl wins.
In the end, we should separate the question of which style is closer to the origin from which style we choose as a modern event. For the former, given the high likelihood that mid-80 month-end soba was something close to soba kiri in the mori style, the claim that hot kake soba is the one true original is historically weak. For the latter, everyone can decide according to their own lifestyle and values. On that basis, my position is to advocate cold New Year's Eve soba, which is closer to the origin and lets you taste soba at its best.
My stance is the opposite. I put weight on the historical flow, that the origin is ambiguous and includes soba mochi and soba gaki. Edo period soba kiri existed in both hot and cold forms, and in the end, an overwhelming majority of people came to share the common image that New Year's Eve equals hot soba. For an event food, the socially shared feeling matters more than faithfully reproducing every historical detail. That is why I deliberately side with the contemporary sensibility and continue to stand on the side of sipping a steaming bowl on a cold year-end night. Whatever interpretation you take of the origins, for each person to choose one side or the other based on their own reasoning is exactly the tension that makes this debate interesting.
This concludes our 10-round debate on whether New Year's Eve soba should be eaten cold or hot. Which style would you choose for your own year-end bowl, and why? Taste, health, tradition, or something else? Share your thoughts and New Year's Eve soba stories in the comments.